They told me Grandpa left me nothing, but what I found in his barn changed everything they thought they owned. My name is Avery Callahan, and when I was 9, my parents said they were taking me on a road trip to see my grandfather for the summer. That summer never ended, and neither did the silence they left behind. We were somewhere in rural Pennsylvania, winding through dense pine forests and gravel roads that barely showed up on a map. The old SUV smelled like stale fast food and sunscreen. My mom, Karen, reached back from the passenger seat, smiled too wide, and said, "Just 3 months, sweetie. Grandpa's gonna love having you around." I nodded. At 9, you believe almost everything. What I didn't realize was that those 3 months would stretch into 14 years. My dad, Carl, didn't speak. He kept his eyes on the road, knuckles white on the steering wheel. The silence said more than words ever could. When we pulled into the long dirt driveway, I could barely see the house at the end through the thick summer haze. It was an old farmhouse warped by time-weathered boards peeling like sunburnt skin. I remember thinking it looked like a place that had stopped waiting for visitors a long time ago. Grandpa Thomas stood at the porch. He wore a faded denim shirt and held a wrench like it was an extension of his hand. He wasn't tall, but he looked like the kind of man storms avoided. My parents didn't unpack anything. Just one duffel bag dropped near the steps. My mom bent down, kissed the air next to my cheek, and whispered, "Be good, okay?" My dad patted my shoulder without looking me in the eyes. Then they got back in the car, reversed down the gravel path, and disappeared into the trees. No promise to call, no return date, nothing. I stood there, bag slipping from my hand, eyes fixed on the curve in the road. They vanished behind. Grandpa cleared his throat and said, "Well, you coming in, or planning to camp on the porch?" His voice wasn't unkind, just matter of fact, like a man who didn't waste words. I followed him inside, dragging the duffel behind me like it weighed 100 pounds. The house smelled like engine oil, sawdust, and black coffee. The walls were covered in old photos of people I didn't recognize. Tools hung in neat rows. Everything had its place. He pointed to the narrow staircase. "Rooms upstairs. Second on the left. Sheets are clean." That first night, I didn't unpack. I didn't cry either. I sat on the edge of the narrow bed, staring out the window, convinced they'd come back. Maybe they'd gotten lost. Maybe they changed their minds. I even imagined headlights turning onto the driveway. But none came. If you've ever had a moment in your life where everything you believed about love, family, or safety collapsed in on itself, then you understand what that night felt like. Like a floor giving out, and no one to catch you. I didn't know it then, but that was the last time I would see my parents for over a decade. The last time I'd hear my mother's overly sweet voice, or see my dad's eyes glaze over with silent guilt. They dropped me off like a package they didn't know how to return, and still I waited. For days, weeks. Each morning I expected to hear a car in the distance. I memorized the way the trees moved in the wind, hoping one day that rustling would mean someone was coming for me. But it never did. Grandpa never asked what happened. He never said he was sorry they left. He didn't coddle or console. He just made space. A plate at the table, a flashlight by the bed, a box of tools set a little closer to where I sat. If you've ever been left behind without explanation, if you've ever stared down an empty driveway waiting for someone who said they loved you, leave a like. Because what comes next? It's a story about silent scars and what it really means to build something that can't be taken away. To be continued. Grandpa Thomas wasn't the kind of man who filled the silence. He let it settle, let it stretch, and taught me how to live inside it. At first I thought it meant he didn't care, but slowly I began to understand his quiet wasn't absence. It was presence, stripped of performance. The morning started early. Before the sun even bruised the sky, I could hear him downstairs, the clatter of pans, the hiss of the percolator, the low murmur of a weathered radio that only played blues and baseball. I'd sit at the top of the stairs for a minute, holding my breath, hoping maybe this was the morning someone called or showed up, or changed their minds. Then I'd descend into the smell of burnt toast and black coffee. He never said good morning. He just slid a plate across the table and muttered, "Eat before it gets cold." It was never fancy. Toast, sometimes eggs if the hens had been generous. He always took the darker slice and left the rest for me until I started switching them when he wasn't looking. After a while, he stopped protesting. He wasn't cruel, just deliberate. He didn't treat me like a child, more like an extra set of hands. And maybe that was exactly what I needed. Someone who didn't pity me. Someone who didn't pretend I hadn't been abandoned and forgotten. In the afternoons, I wandered the yard. Acres of rust-colored grass stretched beyond the fence, touched only by wind and time. There was a barn half collapsed on one side, and a shed that smelled like grease and old memories. That shed would become our quiet church, where lessons were handed down not with sermons, but with socket wrenches and busted spark plugs. One day I lingered too long near the door. He was under the hood of some ancient engine, elbows deep in gears. Without looking, he said, "You just gonna watch? Or you wanna learn?" I froze. That was the first real question he'd asked me since I'd arrived. I walked in and stood next to him. My hands shook when he passed me the wrench. He didn't correct my grip, didn't flinch when I dropped it twice. He just waited silent and steady until I got it right. When the bolt finally turned, he gave a single nod and went back to work. We didn't talk about it afterward. But the next morning, a pair of gloves appeared on the bench. Small, brand new, but unlabeled. No note. Just there. Waiting. That was his way. I began spending hours in that shed. Not because he asked me to, but because it was the only place where time moved without pressure. Where things broken could become whole again, not with hope, but with effort. He taught me how to repair things that others would have thrown away. Not just machines, but the belief that I could do something, fix something, become someone that mattered. And every so often, he'd glance up while I worked, hand me a tool before I knew I needed it. He never said, "I'm proud of you." But once, when I stripped a bolt and didn't curse, he chuckled under his breath and said, "You're learning." That laugh stayed with me for weeks. At night, I'd lie in bed tracing constellations in the cracks on the ceiling. Sometimes I'd whisper to the darkness, asking questions I couldn't say out loud. Did you forget me? Do you think of me? But the silence never answered. And so I stopped asking. Instead, I started leaving notes on the workbench. Just short things, saw blade slipping or gear squeals written in pencil and stuck under tools. He never mentioned them. But by the next day, each problem had quietly disappeared. My notes became conversations. Silent ones, but real. If you've ever had someone in your life who didn't speak love, but showed it in the way they handed you a hammer, or waited without judgment, or made space for you to fail, tell me where you're watching this from right now in the comments. I want to know where the quiet love lives, because that kind of love, it builds more than engines. To be continued. It happened on a gray, windless afternoon. I was in the shed alone looking for masking tape in the old desk beside the workbench. It was the kind of desk that creaked when you leaned on it, the kind that smelled like machine oil and secrets. Most drawers held exactly what you'd expect. Loose nails folded, shop towels, screws organized in pill bottles. But one drawer was stuck. I pulled harder. Something gave. And that's when I found it. A manila folder. My name, Avery Callahan, written in thick black pen across the front. I stared at it for a full minute, the name so familiar, yet suddenly foreign, like seeing it on a gravestone. Inside was a court document stamped and dated. It read, "Voluntary termination of parental rights." The signatures at the bottom were unmistakable. Karen and Carl Callahan. My parents. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I read the lines again and again, trying to make them say something different. They didn't. It was legal, permanent, cold. A file that severed whatever thread had still connected me to them. I was 14 when they filed, a full 5 years after they'd dropped me off and driven away. 5 years of waiting by the window on birthdays, of hoping during holidays, of defending them in my mind with excuses they never earned. And this was the truth. They hadn't just left. They had signed me away, chose absence over responsibility, silence over love. My hands shook as I placed the folder back, lining it up just as I'd found it. I wasn't ready to confront Grandpa. Not yet. I didn't know what would hurt more, hearing him confirm what I read, or discovering he'd never intended me to know. That night, he made chili. As always, it burned slightly on the bottom, a taste I'd come to expect. He didn't ask why I was quiet. Or maybe he did notice, but chose not to press. Instead, after dinner, he reached into the hall closet and pulled out a small wooden box. "Saw this in the barn last week," he said. Inside was a rusted compass and a pocket knife with the initials TC etched into the side. "Yours if you want it." I didn't ask who the initials belonged to. I didn't ask if he knew I'd seen the file. I just nodded and closed the lid. That night, I placed the box on my nightstand and stared at it until I fell asleep. The next morning, he handed me a wrench during a routine fence repair. Our fingers brushed. He didn't pull away. He just said, "You'll need your own set soon," as if passing a torch without ceremony. I realized then that Grandpa had never lied to me. He just withheld the one truth I needed to find on my own, because some things he knew you had to carry yourself. I started building more after that. Not just repairing what broke, but inventing what didn't yet exist. I'd sketch long into the night, things I hadn't seen, hadn't tested, just ideas. Devices that folded, moved, adapted. I wasn't sure what they were yet, but I knew what I wanted them to do: help people like me, the forgotten, the overlooked, the ones written off on paper. I began reading more, scavenging parts from machines left to rot in the shed. Grandpa never stopped me. In fact, he started leaving out blueprints, coiled wires, pieces accidentally left half-assembled, as if setting traps for me to spring. And I did, every time. If you've ever discovered a truth too heavy to carry but carried it anyway, drop a comment below. Tell me how you picked yourself back up. Or tell me you're still in the middle of figuring it out. You're not alone. To be continued. The summer I turned 15, the shed became more than a place to fix broken things. It became a place where I started building my future without even knowing it. One Saturday, I came across an old magazine article buried in a milk crate, stuffed with faded manuals and rusted bolts. It was about a young inventor who designed a foldable wheelchair that could fit in a backpack. I read it twice, then a third time. The idea stuck. Not because it was flashy, but because it made something hard easier. I thought of Grandpa and how he grunted every time he bent to pick up a tool or shifted his leg on cold mornings. It never healed right. He once said, referring to a war injury I knew better than to ask about. That night, I pulled out my notebook and began sketching. I wasn't trying to win awards. I just wanted to fix something, maybe fix him. Or maybe fix the ache I hadn't figured out how to name. The next morning, over breakfast, I told him I needed aluminum tubing, light but strong. He didn't ask what it was for. He just nodded once and took a sip from his chipped mug that said Thomas Callahan Lumber Co. in faded red print. Later that day, he drove into town and returned with an envelope. No tubing, just a receipt and $4.72 in change. That evening, I noticed the old Ford truck, the one with the busted radiator and veteran sticker on the bumper, was gone. It needed more work than it was worth, he said simply. I knew better. He sold it so I could build something that might never work. It took 8 months. The prototype was rough, angled wrong, in places heavy where it should have been light, but it moved. It folded. It did the thing I imagined. Grandpa helped me film a grainy demo on his flip phone, muttering about damn buttons as I adjusted the frame behind me. I submitted it to the Pennsylvania Young Inventors Fair with a 3-page essay and 0 expectations. A month later, a letter came third place with an invitation to join a state STEM cohort partial scholarship included if I kept my GPA above 3.5. When I handed him the letter, Grandpa didn't smile. He just passed me a box of screws and said, "You're gonna need better fasteners." But that night, I found the kitchen table wiped down, dinner reheated, and a small card propped up against the salt shaker. It read in crooked block letters, "You got this." At the fair, surrounded by kids in pressed uniforms and parents who clapped too loudly, I stood in jeans and a flannel that still smelled like machine oil. But when I presented my work, I wasn't nervous. I looked at the chair, the bolts, the way it moved, and I knew it mattered. I knew I mattered. And for the first time, I let myself imagine a world beyond the farm. Not one where I ran away, but one where I built something that reached past the fences. If you've ever chased something just because it whispered to your heart, even when no one clapped for you, share that dream in the comments. And if this story is resonating with where you are right now, drop a like, and let's keep building this journey together. Because sometimes the thing you're building isn't just a machine, it's a version of yourself you haven't met yet. To be continued. There's something poetic about the way tools accumulate over time. Each one tells a story of something broken, something mended, something learned. By the time I turned 17, my corner of Grandpa's shed looked like a miniature workshop, stacked toolboxes, a pegboard with labeled parts, and a growing collection of sketches taped to the walls. None of it was perfect, but it was mine. That winter was especially brutal. The barn heater sputtered more than it worked, and Grandpa's limp grew more pronounced. Every morning he tried to hide the pain, brushing it off with a grunt or a muttered, "Just stiff today." But I saw it. And more than that, I felt it. That's when I decided to take the project further. I wanted to build a device that could support body weight while walking, with adjustable grips and pivoting joints for mobility. It started as a scribble in the corner of a notebook, but soon it consumed my afternoons. I scavenged parts from old garden tools and plumbing supplies. I watched tutorials late into the night, hunched over Grandpa's wheezing old laptop, replaying the same videos until the dial-up froze. Grandpa didn't hover. He never asked what I was building. But more often than not, I'd find just the piece I needed lying on the bench the next morning like a quiet blessing. That's how he showed support, not through praise, but presence. One day I asked him how long he'd kept the shop running after the war. He didn't answer at first. Just tightened a bolt and said long enough to stop dreaming about fire. I didn't press. But that night I understood that some people fight wars they never talk about inside and out. The prototype came together faster than I expected. It wasn't pretty duct tape in places it shouldn't have been, bolts that didn't match, but when Grandpa tried it, his steps were easier. He didn't say thank you. He just used it the next day without a word. That was more than enough. That spring I applied for a regional engineering scholarship. I didn't expect anything. I didn't even tell Grandpa I'd sent in the application. But when the envelope came in the mail with the embossed university seal and the words, "You've been selected," I didn't wait. I ran across the yard, breath catching in my throat. He was repairing a fence post, same way he had every spring. When I handed him the letter, he didn't open it right away. He stared at my face instead. After a moment, he said, "You're gonna go farther than this place, kid." And then, for the first time ever, he hugged me. Not long, not tight, but real. We didn't talk about what that meant, leaving change the past. Instead, he gave me the keys to the old Dodge in the garage and said, "It needs work, but it'll get you there." And that night, for the first time in years, I allowed myself to feel something like hope. Not just for what I could build, but for the kind of person I was slowly becoming. Because fixing machines was never really the point. I was trying to fix myself. And somehow, in the oil-stained silence of that shed, piece by piece, I was. To be continued. I never expected the most valuable thing Grandpa ever gave me would be something so simple. Something that didn't blink or beep or move. It didn't even tick. He gave it to me on my 25th birthday. It was a cold morning in early March, the kind where frost still clung to the edge of the windows, and the sun was barely more than a suggestion behind gray clouds. I came down to the smell of pancakes, real ones this time, not just the boxed kind. There was music playing from the record player in the corner, some old jazz tune I couldn't name, but recognized from hundreds of quiet breakfasts past. A small box sat beside my coffee cup, wrapped in wax paper. No ribbon, no tag. Inside was a brass pocket watch. Heavy. Still. The back was engraved with 2 words, Grace Forward. I didn't understand what it meant right away. The cover opened with a soft click, the way you expect something ancient and delicate to. The hands were frozen, the face clean and bright, but unmoving. I turned to him and asked, "Yours?" He nodded. "Now it's yours." That was all he said. I wore it around my neck that day, tucked beneath my shirt like it was something alive, something that needed warmth. Later that evening, we sat on the back porch. He lit his pipe. I told him about a project I'd been asked to lead at work, a new mobility device prototype for veterans. I didn't expect him to say much, but he surprised me. "About time someone saw what you can build," he said. That was the last thing he ever said to me. The next morning, I knew something was wrong before I opened the bedroom door. There was no smell of coffee, no quiet hum from the radio. The boots he always left by the door were still laced, untouched. He was lying on his bed quilt pulled up to his chest, one hand resting over his heart, the other open, like he'd meant to reach for something. The ambulance came, the neighbors came, but he didn't come back. I remember sitting on the porch with the watch clutched in my palm, listening to the wind whistle through the trees. I kept waiting for the click of his boots, the squeak of the back screen door, the soft grumble of his voice saying, "What are you doing sitting there?" But silence took up residence where his voice used to be. The funeral was simple, like he would have wanted. No flowers, no fanfare, just neighbors in old flannel retired engineers with thick glasses and soft hands, women who'd once brought casseroles and still baked out of habit. I sat in the second row, the watch still warm against my chest. And that's when they walked in. My parents. Karen and Carl Callahan. 14 years. No calls. No letters. No apologies. And yet, there they were dressed in charcoal somber, practiced as if they belonged. They slid into the front pew like they'd earned it. My mother turned, met my eyes, and smiled with soft, wet lashes. "You've grown so much," she whispered, pulling me into a hug I didn't return. My arms stayed stiff. She smelled like lilacs and wealth. My father offered a handshake, then pulled me into a one-armed hug like a politician greeting a donor. "I didn't know you were coming," I said flatly. My mother touched my arm. "Of course we came. He meant a great deal to us." I wanted to scream. "He never spoke your names. Not once." But instead I asked, "What exactly are you here for?" My father's smile twitched. "To help. It's a lot to manage, Avery. You're young. You don't have to do this alone." It wasn't grief they wore, it was calculation, a performance. And I saw it for what it was. To be continued. The moment I asked, "What exactly are you here for?" they hesitated. Not because they were caught off guard, but because they weren't ready to be challenged. I wasn't 9 years old anymore, standing by the gravel road with a duffel bag in hand. I was 25, and I'd buried the only person who ever stayed. Karen adjusted her pearl necklace, her expression softening like she was preparing for a scene she'd rehearsed. "We want to reconnect," she said gently. "It's what your grandfather would have wanted. For us to be a family again." Family. I took a step back. "You signed me away," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "You didn't lose me. You left me." Her smile faltered. My father's mouth tightened. "That's not fair," she said, voice cracking just enough to sound human. "No," I said, "it's not." They followed me outside, away from the murmuring crowd who still hovered near the potato salad and funeral small talk. The sun had dipped behind the barn, casting long shadows across the fence line. My father spoke next. Don't let bitterness get in the way of practicality. There's a lot to deal with land property shares in the company. It affects all of us. No, I said, holding the pocket watch tight against my chest. It affects me. Because I stayed. You didn't. Karen stepped closer. We just want to help. We don't have to make this difficult. You've had 14 years to help, I said. 14 years to show up. There was a long pause. Then my mother said it. The real reason. We just think it would be smart to sit down and talk about everything. Walter left behind. And there it was. Not love, not memory, not grief. Assets. I turned back toward the church, the watch warm in my hand despite the chill. Inside were people who brought casseroles without being asked. People who came not for inheritance, but to say goodbye. I left them standing in the gravel. 2 days later, I walked into the lawyer's office. It smelled like lemon polish and printer ink. Margaret Blake didn't waste time with condolences. She opened a folder, slid a page across the desk, and cleared her throat. Walter Callahan's entire estate, she said, has been legally transferred to Avery Callahan, his granddaughter and legal ward. The words hit like a hammer on glass. Clean. Final. My parents blinked. My mother's mouth dropped. That can't be right. He never discussed this with us. Margaret didn't flinch. He didn't have to. You relinquished parental rights in 2010. I have the signed paperwork. My father leaned forward. We were advised to do that for stability. We had every intention. You terminated your rights, Margaret repeated, sliding the paper forward. My mother shook her head. But Avery's just a child. I met her eyes. I'm 25. Margaret reached beneath the desk and pulled out a small black case. Mr. Callahan anticipated this. She opened the case, removed a scanner, and looked at me. May I see the watch? I hesitated. Then removed it from my neck and handed it over. Margaret opened the back panel, revealing a small biometric chip I never knew was there. She scanned it. The light blinked green. Verified, she said. My father's voice turned sharp. What is this? Margaret didn't answer him. She looked at me. Your grandfather encoded the will to your heartbeat. This estate cannot be claim transferred or contested by anyone else. You're the sole heir. The room went silent. If you've ever stood face to face with someone who once erased you and finally held the power they thought you'd never find, take a moment to breathe. Then tell me, what would you have said? Drop your words below, and if this moment hit something inside, you leave a like. You're not alone. You're not powerless. Not anymore. I stood the watch in my hand and walked out of that office into the gray light of afternoon. The wind felt different on my face. Lighter. Sharper. Like it belonged to me now. Because everything Walter built, he built for me. To be continued. I didn't drive straight home after the lawyer's office. Instead, I pulled off the main road and followed the gravel path to the edge of the property line, where the field opened wide and wild, just how Grandpa always liked it. I sat on the hood of the old Dodge, staring at the horizon as the sun sank low, turning the barn into a silhouette. I could still hear his voice muttering about loose bolts and worn tires, but mostly I could feel the silence pressing in again. It was different now, though. Not the silence of abandonment, but of preparation, because I knew they weren't done, and I was right. The next morning, I found a manila envelope tucked beneath the gate. Inside was a formal notice, intent to challenge the will filed by Carl and Karen Callahan, natural parents of Avery Callahan, on grounds of undue influence and questionable mental competency of the deceased. Neatly clipped behind it was a stack of highlighted medical records, blood pressure readings, minor cognitive notes from Walter's last checkups. They were coming after everything. That afternoon, I heard the rumble of a black SUV climbing the hill. It parked just short of the barn tires, grinding against the gravel like they were chewing on the land. Karen stepped out first. No sunglasses this time, no pearls, just a beige coat and a tired face. Carl followed, holding his phone like it was a weapon. I stayed on the porch, arms crossed. I told you not to come back, I said. We want to resolve this peacefully, she replied, voice even rehearsed. There's no need for this to get ugly. Carl added, "You're not thinking clearly, Avery. This property, this burden, it'll swallow you whole." I didn't blink. "We've spoken to a few people," Karen continued. "There's press interest. A young woman inherits nearly $100 million and cuts her grieving parents out. It's a compelling narrative." I clenched the railing so hard my knuckles ached. "We're offering you a deal," Carl said, stepping forward. "Sell us partial stake in the company. Keep the house. Keep the land around it. Keep the watch. Whatever's sentimental. But let us handle the rest." I laughed low and bitter. "You think this place will ruin me?" I asked, stepping off the porch. It raised me. Karen's jaw twitched. "You don't have to do this," she said. "You don't have to be alone." I walked past them toward the edge of the field where the wheat had just started to rise again. I pointed at the barn. I was alone, every birthday, every graduation, every Sunday when I brought Walter cocoa during chemo and watched him fall asleep mid-sentence. "Where were you then?" Neither answered. Carl's voice dropped. "You'll regret shutting us out." I opened the gate. "Then sue me." And I shut it behind them. That night I sat on the shed floor surrounded by Grandpa's blueprints. My hands trembled. Not from fear, but from adrenaline. I knew this wasn't just about defending an inheritance. It was about defending what he built. What we built. And I wasn't going to let it be rewritten. The next morning, I drove to the county clerk's office and filed a cease and desist against any unauthorized contact regarding the estate. Then I went home, locked the barn doors, and started reorganizing the space. Because if they were going to come for this place, they were going to see exactly what it meant. Not just to me, but to everyone it could still reach. This wasn't about money. It never was. It was about history, about choice, about who gets to define your worth, you or the people who once threw you away. To be continued. It took them less than a week to escalate. A second black envelope arrived, this time delivered by courier. Inside was a thicker file, legal language affidavits, expert evaluations. One line was underlined in red. The decedent may have been subject to manipulation by dependent party Avery Callahan in final years. Manipulation. That word burned hotter than any insult ever could. They were painting me as a gold digger, a puppet master. A calculating, ungrateful granddaughter who twisted an old man's will for personal gain. And the worst part? They weren't just preparing for a court battle. They were crafting a narrative. Later that afternoon, I got the call from a local reporter. "We're doing a piece on the Callahan estate," he said. "Your parents have spoken briefly on record. Do you want to respond?" I didn't hang up. I didn't yell. I just said, "Come see the place. Bring your camera." He did. And I showed him everything. I showed him the shed, the blueprints, the half-built mobility devices lined up like soldiers in waiting. I showed him the photos of me and Walter repairing fences, rewiring light sockets, restoring the same old radio 6 times because we never wanted to throw it out. I showed him the Whitmore Circle, the classroom I'd created in the old barn now filled with workbenches, circuits, whiteboards covered in student sketches. He asked me one question: "Why are you still here?" I looked out at the field and answered truthfully. Because this place didn't just raise me, it gave me back to myself. That night I knew they'd come again. And they did. Same SUV, same gravel crunch. This time only my mother stepped out. No coat, no earrings, just a manila folder in her hand. "I'm not here to fight," she said. "Just to see." She didn't come past the gate. She didn't push. She looked around at the lab sign, the kids racing through the yard with wires and prototypes in hand. "I read about it in the paper," she said softly. "Didn't think you'd actually do something with it." The wind kicked up. I didn't answer. "You were always like him," she added. "Even when you were little." That hit me somewhere deep, but I kept my voice even. "You didn't come here to say that." She shook her head. "No. I came to say I'm sorry. For everything. We were scared, Avery. And selfish. But mostly scared. I didn't forgive her. Not in that moment. Not yet. But I didn't hate her either. And that's when she said it. "Your father's sick. Pancreatic cancer. It won't be long." She didn't ask me to visit. Didn't ask for anything, really. Just turned and walked back to the SUV. Her shoulders looked smaller than I remembered. When she left, I stayed on the porch. The sun was setting behind the barn, casting long shadows across the lab windows. If you've ever stood at the edge of pain and grace, if you've ever felt that flicker of forgiveness trying to spark beneath layers of hurt, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from tonight? And what would you have said? Because sometimes the hardest thing isn't telling someone off. It's deciding whether or not to let go of the weight they left in you. To be continued? The days that followed felt hollow in a way I couldn't explain. Not sad, not relieved, just suspended. Like the world was holding its breath. I swept the porch twice a day, even when it was clean. Checked the mailbox more often than usual. Rearranged tools that didn't need rearranging. Then one morning, while cleaning out the loft above Grandpa's study, I noticed something odd. The old rug he used to sit on never laid flat, it always curled slightly at the corner. I pulled it back and found a tiny iron hook drilled into the floorboards. My heart thudded. There beneath a warped panel was a tin box. Inside were his journals. Dozens of them, bound in cracked leather and stained with oil from his fingers. But on top of the stack, as if placed with purpose, was a single envelope. My name written across it in his handwriting, strong, slanted, deliberate. I didn't cry when he died. I cried when I read that letter. Avery, if you're reading this, then I'm gone. But if I raised you right then, you're still standing, still breathing, still building. That's all I ever wanted. The rest of the letter unraveled like a blueprint of his dreams. He'd been planning something for years. Not a company, not an empire. A foundation. The Whitmore Circle. He wanted a place where kids like me, kids forgotten by their families, underestimated by the world, could learn, invent, and fail without shame. A mobile robotics classroom. Outreach programs. Tools. Teachers' shelter support. He'd drawn schematics, financial models. He'd even started paperwork with Margaret Blake years ago. I stayed in that loft all night, surrounded by his words. Every diagram, every line of code, every dream he never got to see through, I felt it like a fire in my ribs. By morning, I knew exactly what I had to do. First, I called Margaret. She answered on the second ring. He told me you'd find it. She said, calm as always. I've been waiting for your call. By fall, the barn had transformed. The old equipment shed became a prototype lab. I hired a retired engineer from Eugene who had worked on NASA tools in the 90s. We ordered parts in bulk. Grandpa's contacts from the lumber co-op donated scrap metal wheels and wiring. And then the kids came. At first, just a handful, nervous, shy, unsure what this strange rural classroom even was. But soon they filled the space with noise and light. I heard laughter echo in corners that had only ever known silence. I watched hands solder wires, rewire fans, build circuits from scratch. And I remembered being that kid fumbling with bolts, terrified of getting it wrong. The first child to finish a full project was a girl named Madison, 11 years old, in foster care since she was 4. She built a robotic arm that could pour water into a cup. When she asked if she could keep it, I said no. She looked crushed. So I handed her the soldering iron and said, build a better one. She did. I stood in that workshop one night after everyone had gone home, the air still warm from the day's projects, and I whispered aloud, you did it, Grandpa. He didn't leave me a fortune to spend. He left me a mission to carry. He didn't just believe in tools. He believed in repair, and not just of machines, but of people. To be continued. Some nights, I'd sit on the porch with the brass pocket watch still hanging around my neck, watching the barn glow from within. The laughter of kids tinkering with motors and light sensors spilled into the evening air like music. That light, it wasn't just fluorescent. It was legacy pulsing out from the heart of everything Grandpa built and everything I was now continuing. But just as the warmth of creation started to feel like home again, the cold of litigation returned. A new envelope, a new claim. Carl and Karen filed an emergency motion to freeze the assets of the estate, citing mismanagement and emotional distress from being excluded. They were relentless. The paperwork grew thicker. Their attorneys were now pushing narratives to local media. My inbox flooded with interview requests, speculation, clickbait headlines, estranged daughter builds empire while parents are shut out. The pressure mounted. Margaret stayed firm, but I could see it in her eyes. She knew how nasty this could get. "They're hoping to exhaust you," she said flatly. "They can't win in court, but they can drain your spirit." But they underestimated one thing: I wasn't standing alone. At the next community open house for the Whitmore Circle, more than 100 people showed up. Former students of Grandpa's business, farmers he once helped fix tractors for free, veterans he gave tools to when no one else did, parents of the kids I was now mentoring, and at the end of the day, someone pinned a hand-drawn note to the barn door. "You didn't inherit money. You inherited purpose. Keep building." That night, something in me settled. Let them try. Because this land, it didn't belong to greed. It belonged to resilience. A week later, Carl showed up alone. He wore a blazer and fake calm, walked up the porch steps like he belonged there. "I want to make peace," he said. "Funny," I replied. "You started a war." He offered me a folder. Inside, an offer to buy back partial ownership of Whitmore Solutions Inc., Grandpa's company, which I now held the majority shares of. He promised to step back from the estate, promised to end the lawsuits. All I had to do was give them something: a stake, a nameplate, a piece of history they'd never earned. I closed the folder and handed it back. "I've spent most of my life fixing what you broke," I said. "I'm not handing you the screwdriver now." He looked away, jaw clenched. "You're being emotional." "No," I said calmly. "I'm being exact." He stood to leave but paused at the bottom of the steps. "You'll regret this." I looked past him toward the barn where Madison was teaching a younger student how to calibrate a motor. "No," I said. "I already regret not walking away from you sooner." If you've ever had to stand your ground, even when the ones trying to shake it were the people who gave you your name, drop a comment. Where are you watching from right now? And what would you have done if someone tried to buy your past back with money they didn't earn? Because forgiveness is one thing, surrender is another. And I had built too much to surrender anything. To be continued. I never imagined the old barn the same place where I once learned how to fix a leaking pipe with duct tape, and stubbornness would one day echo with the sounds of purpose. That's the only word I can find for it now: purpose. It hummed through every workbench, every soldering iron, every triumphant laugh when a circuit finally blinked on. The Whitmore Circle had grown faster than I ever expected. By late spring, we had over 30 kids rotating through the program. Some came from group homes, others from broken households. A few simply needed a place where failure wasn't a verdict, it was part of the design. They weren't here for school credit. They were here to build things that hadn't existed before, just like I once was. I'd often walk between benches offering advice or just silently watching. The younger ones would beam when I noticed their work. The older ones, especially the foster teens, kept their heads down pretending they didn't care, but their grip on the tools would tighten ever so slightly when I stood near. I recognized that posture, that hunger to be seen without being pitied. One afternoon, a boy named Elijah, tall, quiet 15, stayed after the others had gone. He was trying to program a robotic car to avoid obstacles, but his code kept looping in circles. He slammed the keyboard. "It's pointless," he muttered. I sat beside him. "The point isn't to get it perfect today." He looked at me, eyes sharp with frustration. "Then what is the point?" I thought for a second, then answered. "To prove to yourself that your mind can do more than survive. It can build, design, create." He stared at the screen for a long time, then reopened the code. That night, I sat in the loft where I'd found Grandpa's letter. I kept one of his journals open next to mine, pages worn and smudged. Sometimes I just read his notes, not for instruction, but for reassurance. His thoughts were still here, embedded in the ink, guiding me like always. He had written something once halfway down a page about torque. When you teach someone to build, you give them back control. I understood that now more than ever. But even as the lab thrived, the lawsuits loomed. Court hearings, media inquiries, depositions. The noise grew louder. It tried to bleed into this place to infect what was sacred. But every time I felt overwhelmed, I'd step into the barn and let the sound of saws and circuits drown everything else out. Margaret kept me updated with legal progress. She was steady, fierce in her defense, but cautious. They want to drain you emotionally, she reminded me again. Keep your eyes on the mission. So I did. Instead of answering reporters, I posted photos of student projects on our tiny website. I shared progress updates, wrote blog entries about what each new circuit meant to the kid who built it. People noticed. Donations trickled in. A retired MIT engineer even reached out offering to visit and teach for a week. One Saturday morning, I stepped outside to find two kids chasing each other through the wheat fields behind the barn wires and blueprints clutched in their arms like flags. They were laughing, uncontrolled, wild, free. I stood there watching them and whispered to the wind, "You'd be proud, Grandpa." He didn't leave me with closure. He left me with a compass, and it was still pointing forward. To be continued. Thanksgiving came quiet that year. No invitations, no family dinners. Just the low hum of a space heater in the barn and the soft click of the soldering iron cooling beside me. Most of the kids had gone home wherever home meant for them, but a few stayed behind. The ones with nowhere else to go. The ones like I used to be. We made grilled cheese with a flat iron and watched a documentary on old inventors projected onto a bedsheet nailed to the wall. Madison fell asleep halfway through, her head resting on a pile of jumper wires. Elijah kept working, determined to finish a motion sensor before morning. I just sat in the corner watching the blue light dance across their faces, feeling something deeper than gratitude, inheritance. But I should have known peace wouldn't last. That afternoon, another envelope arrived. No postage, hand-delivered. Inside was a new threat intent to depose financial records for mismanagement of estate assets, signed by Carl and Karen Callahan. They were now alleging that I had used emotional coercion to gain control of Walter's company and its assets. It was more than an attack on the will. It was an attack on me. I didn't cry. I walked to the barn and ran my fingers across the edge of Grandpa's original blueprint for the lab, now pinned beside the window. He'd drawn it 10 years before I even knew it existed, and I remembered what Margaret once told me. They will try to exhaust you until you forget why you started. So I wrote a letter, not to them, to every donor, every volunteer, every student's guardian, every person who had ever asked what this place was. I explained everything. I told the story, not the legal one, not the scandalous one, the true one, of a girl who was left behind and a grandfather who built something in silence so that one day she'd never have to feel small again. The response was overwhelming. People shared the letter. Donations doubled. A small journalist group offered to run a piece on our story, our real story. And then something unexpected happened. Karen returned. She drove alone. No black SUV. Just a beige sedan that kicked dust as it rattled up the path. I met her at the gate. She didn't bring lawyers or papers, just a thermos of coffee in her hands, gripped like a peace offering. I read the letter, she said. You wrote it like you were already saying goodbye. I said nothing. She looked around the kids running between stations, a girl adjusting the leg of a 3D printed walker. You did all this? No, I replied. We did. She nodded slowly, lips tight. I came to say, I'm sorry I missed it. I didn't hug her. I didn't invite her in. But I also didn't shut the gate. She stood there a few minutes longer, then placed the thermos on the post and left. I never opened it. That night, Madison stood in the doorway of the loft. What happens if they take it away? She asked. I turned toward her. They won't. Are you sure? I looked around the space we'd built together, walls scrawled with ideas, shelves of half-built dreams, blueprints pinned like prayers. I'm sure. Because even if they took the company, the land, the assets, they could never take this. If you've ever built something from scratch, not out of pride, but out of pain, Tell me what it is. Drop it in the comments. Let the world see what they can't erase. And if you've been here since the beginning of this story, hit that like button. Not for me, but for the people who never gave up on building something better. Because legacy isn't what you leave in your will, it's what you pass on with your hands. To be continued? The first snow came early that year. By mid-December, the barn roof shimmered with a thin layer of frost, and the fields behind it turned a muted silver under a pale sky. Inside, the heaters buzzed at full blast, and the kids worked with their sleeves rolled down and fingerless gloves on. Even in the cold, the energy inside the Whitmore circle never faded. But something in me had shifted. It wasn't fear anymore. It was finality. The understanding that no matter what happened in court, no matter how long the fight dragged on the person I had become in this space, wasn't someone my parents could ever erase or undo. I'd stopped waiting for apologies, and I'd long since given up on explanations. Still, I couldn't ignore the letter that arrived one quiet Sunday evening. Handwritten, no return address. Inside were two things: a small photo of me as a baby sitting in my mother's lap, and a folded note in her familiar cursive. He was right, it read. You always belonged to something bigger than us. I'm sorry we were too small to carry it. Mom. I stared at the photo for a long time. I didn't feel pain or sadness. Just the strange weight of recognition that I had once been part of a life I no longer claimed. I didn't reply. Instead, I stood in the barn watching Madison help a new student adjust their robotic arm. She didn't ask me for permission. She just saw what needed to be done and did it. That was the moment I knew she was ready. I sat her down later that week. Next year, I said, you'll be leading the robotics program. Her eyes widened. Me? You've already started, I said. You just didn't know it. She looked nervous, but I recognized the fire in her, the same flame Grandpa once lit in me. Over the next few weeks, she began mentoring two younger students. I watched her explain things with clarity and care. She still struggled sometimes, but that was the point. Growth doesn't look perfect, it looks earned. Sometimes after they all left, I'd go up to the loft. The old desk still held my journal, Grandpa's final letter, and a tiny box of washers he never got around to sorting. I'd open the window and breathe in the silence, the same silence that once haunted me now, a friend that kept me grounded. One night, I sat with the pocket watch in my palm, turning it slowly. It still didn't tick, but it didn't have to. Its value wasn't in what it measured, but what it meant. That evening, I wrote a final line in my journal. The past never gave me closure, but it gave me a place to begin. To be continued. The court date finally came. A cold Monday morning in January. I wore a navy suit plain and pressed with Grandpa's brass pocket watch tucked into my coat. Not as jewelry, as armor. The courtroom buzzed with quiet tension, legal pads, flipping whispers between attorneys, the soft echo of footsteps across marble floors. Carl and Karen sat across from me. They didn't look at me, not even once. Their attorney made the usual statements: undue influence, emotional manipulation, misappropriation of estate assets. I didn't flinch. When it was my turn, Margaret stood calm and measured. She spoke not about money, but about mission. Not about ownership, but stewardship. Then she introduced Exhibit C, a short documentary. It was the one we had made with the journalist team months earlier. It showed the barn, the kids, the circuits, the blueprints, Madison's robotic arm, Elijah's obstacle-avoiding car, and me talking about the Whitmore Circle not as an inheritance, but as a continuation. I watched Carl's posture shift as the video played. Karen's fingers twitched nervously in her lap. When it ended, the room was silent. Then the judge leaned forward and said, "This is not just about legality, it's about intention." She ruled in our favor. All claims dismissed. Estate validated. I was declared the sole legal heir and executor of Whitmore Solutions and its charitable trust. I walked out into the cold sunlight, not smiling, but breathing differently. That night, back at the barn, the kids had gathered with a handmade banner that read, "Welcome Home Avery." Madison handed me a cupcake with a gear stuck in the frosting. I laughed for the first time in months. Later, as the barn quieted and the snow outside thickened, I sat by the window and thought back not to the courtroom, or the lawsuits, or the betrayals, but to the first night Grandpa let me hold a drill. I'd been terrified. My hands shook. I dropped the screw 3 times, but he just smiled and said, "It's okay. You're building something. Don't rush the beginning." Now, years later, I understood what he meant. I wasn't just building machines. I was building foundations for kids, for legacy, for healing, and for myself. If you've made it this far in the story, I want to ask you something real. What's something you've built not with money, but with courage? Let me know in the comments. And if this story moved you, even just a little, share it with someone who might need a reminder that starting over is also a kind of power. We built something beautiful here, not from inheritance, from intention, to be continued, in every hand that chooses to create. Sometimes when the barn is quiet and the kids have gone home, I walk out to the old oak tree behind the field, Grandpa's favorite thinking spot. The branches stretch wide like arms, always open no matter the season. I sit beneath it, notebook in hand, and just breathe. It's strange how healing doesn't arrive all at once. It's not an event. It's a quiet decision you keep making every day to keep showing up, to keep building, to keep loving something even if it was once tied to pain. The Whitmore Circle isn't just a program anymore. It's a promise that no child will be left behind simply because the world told them they were too broken, too strange, too much. It's a place where mistakes are part of the blueprint and silence is only temporary. Madison now runs half the daily operations. Elijah wants to start a drone engineering team next fall. And me, I finally let myself rest some nights. Not because the work is done, but because it's no longer just mine to carry. The past still knocks sometimes, in memories, in echoes, in old habits I'm still unlearning. But I've stopped answering with fear. Now I answer with purpose. So if you're still listening, if this story reached a quiet part of you, I want to leave you with this. You don't need a perfect family to start again. You need a reason. You don't need to inherit wealth. You can inherit strength. And you don't need to fix everything. You just need to believe that you're worth the fixing too. If that's something you believe in, if you felt this story in your chest, hit that subscribe button. Stay with us. Because this isn't just my journey. It could be yours too. Let's keep building.